Okay, let's get started. I think some more people will be joining us and trickling in, but we've got about 35 participants in the room, which is a great start. So hello and welcome to everyone joining us from across the globe. Thanks for joining in your morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is where you are. My name is Kate Byom, and I'm Deputy Director for Governance at Pact. We are very pleased to share with you today the findings from a learning review Pact commissioned as part of the USAID-funded Human Rights Support Mechanism, or HRSM. Within a consortium led by Freedom House, Pact leads the efforts to streamline political economy analysis into a range of USAID-funded human rights programs. As the HRSM award comes to an end in September of this year, we took the opportunity to critically reflect on the value of these political economy analysis processes and determine whether or not they contribute significantly to our work. Our work on applied political economy analysis, or APEA, under HRSM, included developing global guidance for APEA practitioners within the human rights sector. It also included leading or supporting APEA processes in 11 HRSM Associate Awards globally and producing 19 total APEA studies. On this map, you will see the countries in blue were those that were included in this learning review that we're talking about today. And countries in purple have had APEAs under HRSM that were not included in this particular review. The projects included in this learning review are the data-driven advocacy activity in Tanzania, the Conectando Caminos por los Derechos activity in Colombia, and the expanding access to justice activity in Somalia. PEA and thinking and working politically have become almost buzzwords in our sector. Many of us intuitively know their value, but measuring the contributions of these methodologies and mindsets to our work is really challenging. Pact conducted a learning review in 2019 as well, which is available on our website, and looked more specifically at the efficacy of processes for APEA. This most recent learning review builds on the findings of the previous 2019 review. So to carry out this review, we commissioned the policy practice to examine whether and to what extent APEA contributes to programmatic results by supporting project decision-making. My colleague will drop a link to the learning review in the chat so everyone can download it from Pact's website, if you please. I will caveat that this is not an evaluation of PEA in our programs, but rather an opportunity to step back and trace PEA processes and findings to decisions and to results. Importantly, the 3 case studies were carefully selected because they are examples of projects that have used APEA effectively and where the project teams think and work politically. This is important to note because this isn't a representative sample of how impactful APEA is on all projects that use it. These findings tell us what is possible when APEA is done well and when the team is sufficiently bought into the process. I am thrilled to be chairing this roundtable discussion with the authors of this learning review, Alina, Rocha, Menocal, and Laure-Hélène Piron. Alina is principal at the policy practice and director of the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice. Laure-Hélène is director of the policy practice. You'll see their full bios in the chat. They will be presenting the key findings from their analysis of how these 3 human rights programs used APEA, the decisions it informed, and the extent to which these decisions contributed to programmatic results. Joining us today as well are 2 esteemed discussants who will offer their commentary and reflections on the learning review. Laura Pavlovic is the Deputy Director of the Democracy, Rights, and Governance Center at USAID Washington. And Adam Lingson is a Project Management Specialist at USAID Tanzania and the Agreement Officer's representative for the Data-Driven Advocacy activity. We'll have time for questions and discussion after Alina and Laure-Hélène's presentation, and again after Laura and Adam's comments, leaving plenty of time for rich discussion. Before we start, I want to share a few housekeeping items with you. The first is that, as you can see, this session is being recorded, so please keep this in mind as you ask your questions. The second is that all of your cameras are disabled, but you have the ability to mute and unmute yourselves freely. So please use that feature with discretion. And if you would like to ask questions during the two Q&A periods, you have a couple of options. You can either raise your hand in Microsoft Teams and ask a question directly by unmuting yourself, or you can write your questions in the chat. In either case, we would ask you to briefly tell us your name and institutional affiliation. And now, without further ado, I would like to turn to Alina and Laure-Hélène to present some of their key findings from the learning review.
Thank you so much, Kate, firstly for the opportunity to do this work that Laure-Hélène and I have thoroughly enjoyed, and we're thrilled to have this opportunity to share the findings and insights emerging from our analysis with the panel and also with our audience today. So just briefly to give you a glimpse of what's coming, we will be sharing insights from the case studies, and then we'll be also sharing some of the synthesis points that emerge most prominently for us. So briefly, next slide, please. As Kate has mentioned, Laure-Hélène and I were asked to do this learning review, examining the 3 HRSM-funded projects that she flagged, including data-driven advocacy in Tanzania, Conectando Caminos por los Derechos in Colombia, and expanding access to justice in Somalia. The learning review's objectives were to understand how APA has contributed to project decision-making and how, in turn, this has contributed to impact and why, and also to draw out lessons and considerations for the Progress Consortium's approach to APA for human rights programming going forward. I don't want to delve too much into our approach and methodology, but just briefly to highlight again what Kate said, that this is a learning review and not an evaluation. It was a desk-based exercise that involved a review of project documents, as well as a number of interviews with Pact staff, partners involved in each activity, and a few other relevant stakeholders, including within USAID and for Somalia, other donors as sounding boards. Next slide, please. I think we're ready for the case studies. And over to you, Laure-Hélène.
Thank you. So I'll start with Tanzania. Just give a bit of background on the project, and I'll highlight how they did the PAs and also some of the insight we gained. Next slide, please, Kate. So this was a 6-year project, 2017 to 2023, $11.5 million, and that included a costed extension. So the project was well received by USAID. The overall goal was to support civil society in Tanzania to undertake advocacy based on evidence. And this became really challenging as the project started because of the political context, with President Magufuli passing some laws, the Statistics Act, preventing the use of data. The word human rights could not be mentioned. So it was a really challenging start for the project. The context improved after 2021, but it's still not a completely open political system and civic space. We identified achievements through our interviews to try to trace how the APAs were then being able to influence decisions that were relevant for these achievements. We're not saying this is everything that the projects achieved. As Alina said, this was not an evaluation. This was very partial based on the people we spoke to. But for this project in particular, overall, the fact that it was able to operate and have successes in this difficult context, we consider to be an achievement in itself. We also found improved relationship between the civil society groups supported by the project and government authorities on the mainland and in Zanzibar, which again wasn't given from the start. We traced some specific achievements linked to policy or regulations or laws that were passed in Tanzania to some of the project activities. And then overall, there's been strengthening of capacity of the CSO supported, especially those linked to youth and youth-based organizations, which became one of the priorities for USAID. Next slide, please. I'm now going to describe how the project undertook political economy analysis. So all those projects we reviewed had a baseline APA as part of the design of this human rights support mechanism. So there was a baseline in 2017, and then also all the projects had annual analysis being done. So, for example, the baseline in this case identified how to work on those different human rights issues and identified go and no-go areas, themes that were too sensitive to work on, such as LGBT plus rights or civic space, and then some issues that were slightly less challenging to work on, such as women or youth issues. What's interesting, each project did it a bit differently. So in Tanzania, you also had quarterly lighter touch APAs that were done on specific topics of interest. So it might be looking more depth at the Zanzibari politics or at legal reforms or constitutional reforms. So they were done on a quarterly basis with the highlights shared with the USAID in the quarterly report. And then also the project does weekly or monthly scanning of the environment. We wouldn't see them as political economy analysis, but it's a way of keeping up to date with the context. What's interesting is that you have 2 Pact persons dedicated to supporting the PA process in Tanzania. Even though the project is led by Freedom House, Pact has a responsibility for the PA, but the whole team, management, the chief of party, people from different roles were involved in the PA process. And then finally, and it's great to have Adam on the call, USAID has been involved in the PA, asking questions, reviewing the analysis. And the final slide now to give you a feel for what we found in terms of how APAs influence decisions. So overall, the strategic approach adopted by the project itself was informed by PA. So the idea is to engage constructively with government, was a choice made by the project, reaffirmed in the inception phase. Could I ask everyone to go on mute, please? There's a bit of background noise. So the overall strategic decision was really one that was a choice by the project management. And we can then trace that to the different results that were achieved. Specific decisions in terms of who to work with. So the project operated with working groups, coalitions that were designed specifically for the project, not necessarily people who worked together before, to select the right ones. And they were working people on new media issues or gender-based violence. So the way they were selected, the way they worked together was also informed by those PAs. There was a rapid response grant mechanism, and we found that was also really well informed by PAs. And one of the successes we identified, influencing reform of the Political Parties Act, was achieved in part because the project partners were registered as a way of avoiding harassment by government. They could prove they'd been invited to government consultation on that act, which meant that when they shared their insight with Parliament, they had the space to do so. And finally, just to give you a feel for methodology, we're not claiming that all the APAs always influence everything that was covered in the analysis itself. So for example, the project did a lot of work around supporting youth-led organizations. So there was data assessment of their capacity and so on. So the APAs would be one element of that general evidence base being generated by the project. Thank you. And I'm now going to pass on to Alina to talk about the Colombia case study. So next slide, please.
Alina, you are muted.
Okay. Good. I think, yeah, great. Sorry for that. Thank you so much, Laure-Hélène. And now, yeah, briefly to turn over to Conectando Caminos por los Derechos, or CCD. CCD is a $19 million 4-year program from 2020 to 2024, implemented by 4 consortium members. And these are Freedom House, which is the award lead, Pact, ABA Rowley, and Internews. The CCD aims to support the transition from short-term humanitarian to long-term development assistance for migrants, Colombian returnees, and receptor communities through improved citizen security and community cohesion in these host communities, in particular in relation to what is happening in Venezuela. The CCD is now in its 3rd year of implementation, and it works with 70 local partners across 11 urban municipalities. Just to give you a sense of what the achievements to date have been, one of them is putting the issue of migration from Venezuela and human rights at the center of the public policy agenda, and contributing to a more consistent incorporation of migration, of a migration lens in national policies around human rights. A second achievement has been to build the capacity of local human rights organizations and CSO human rights protection networks, working with and often led by migrants from Venezuela. And thirdly, fostering more productive relationships between these local civil society organizations and human rights protection networks on the one hand, and local public authorities, including in terms of CSO participation in migration policy discussions at the local level, especially. Next slide, please. So now let me tell you a little bit about how CCD has gone about undertaking analysis. CCD is unique among the 3 case studies that we looked at in that it has several other distinct tools or frameworks of analysis beyond or besides APEA. And each CCD implementing partner leads on and undertakes its own analysis. So, for example, the APA is obviously led by Pact, but there's also social network analysis led by Freedom House, information ecosystems assessment led by Internews, legal and policy analysis led by ABA Rowley, gender and social inclusion analysis led by Rowley, and actor mapping, which is led by Pact. As the lead on APA, Pact has sought to bring together the other analytical tools under APA as an overarching umbrella, but this has not always been easy. Within CCD, APA tends to be seen as a deliverable that Pact is responsible for, rather than as something that is more broadly shared and owned. In general, APAs have been led by Pact staff and supported by external consultants, while other consortium partners have not been involved in the undertaking of the analysis as such. They have been brought in mostly when it comes to share findings for their input and feedback. USAID itself does not seem to be involved in the APA process, but it does engage on the substance of this analysis and very much appreciates it. And I think importantly, and to the credit of the CCD team, USAID has felt that the analysis that is shared with them is holistic and comprehensive, despite the challenges that the CCD continues to face as a result of having several distinct frameworks of analysis. Now, in terms of APA iterations, there have been 4 iterations to date, while other forms of analysis have been less recurrent. The first iteration of the APA, which was done at inception, was by far the most extensive and also intensive in terms of the scope and ambition, really, to gather evidence on the links between migration and human rights. The next 2 iterations of APA focused on new CCD municipalities, while the last one revisited 4 CCD municipalities. With each iteration of APA, there have been efforts to refine questions, incorporate new areas of inquiry. So, for example, on GESI, violence against women, workings of the new government decree regularizing the status of migrants from Venezuela and what that means in practice, updating the actor mapping, etc. But there are different views within the consortium partners on the value add of iterations beyond the first inception phase 1. Next slide, please. Okay, so how have APAs influenced CCD decisions? The APAs have provided evidence to respond to contextual challenges and changes. In particular, through the APAs and other forms of analysis, the CCD has played a critical role in producing and sharing research and evidence, including in a highly accessible and visual way, on the migration situation from Venezuela and human rights landscape in Colombia. This data gathering and analytical function has been widely welcomed by different stakeholders, from the government of Colombia to local CSOs to USAID. Analysis by the CCD emphasizing the need to move from a purely humanitarian approach to the migration crisis from Venezuela towards a longer-term human rights-based response that focuses on improved citizen security and social cohesion has helped to inform both the government of Colombia's and USAID's approach to the crisis. APA has also been important in helping to build relationships of trust across actors and to broker and facilitate more productive engagement between CSOs and authorities at the local level. Analysis has also shaped the substance and geographic coverage of the CCD. For example, APAs have helped to elevate human trafficking as a major area of CCD engagement, which was not there as prominently from the beginning. incorporate a focus on vulnerable youth more explicitly into the CCD, select municipalities where there is greater government and civil society capacity, inform the rapid response mechanism and fund in relation to issues of focus and local organizations that the CCD should be working with or supporting, and this resonates also from the case of Tanzania, and develop a citizen security and social integration index to measure complex concepts and compare progress on, for example, trust and institutional capacity across municipalities. Last but not least, APAs have also helped to confirm assumptions and strategic decisions to date within the CCD, while testing the overall strategy and assumptions of how change happens has not been done to date. And I think that's an important point to highlight as well. Over to you, Laure-Hélène, I think, for the Somalia case study.
Thanks. So for Somalia, it's much more challenging operational context. It was a complicated program that had some pivots and changes and much more difficult to operate in, but with a very innovative approach to APAs. So the project was 2018 to 2023, $25 million, so the largest of all the three projects, led by ABA Rowley with Pact support. The objective was to improve access to justice and effective mechanisms to address grievances in Somalia, with a range of activities around principally paralegals, justice providers, so non-legally trained experts who can provide basic advice on how to seek justice, as well as access to justice services and sort of formal courts, for example, and also committees whereby people would know how to access justice. The context in Somalia was one of high insecurity, so you can't have international staff travel to Somalia beyond the airport. There were delayed elections during the period, causing political instability, famines, and so on. COVID, of course, affected all three case studies. In addition, in Somalia and the sector, you've got legal pluralism. You have different ways in which people can access justice, and navigating those different systems is always very tricky for citizens in Somalia. The achievements, and based on the interviews we had, was first of all, this work around paralegal justice providers was quite unique in Somalia. It's something that's been done over the years, over the last 20 years across the globe. But for Somalia, it was the first project aiming to do so. So that's a big achievement. Then we have some more specific achievement that we have identified, such as, for example, a study on Sharia law and how they can then be used to access individual rights as opposed to communal rights was important, or specific dispute resolution mechanisms. We haven't found a whole range of other achievements, in part because the evaluation is still happening for the project, but also it was harder to get data on exactly what the APAs were doing and how those were influencing decision-making. A major change to the project, which had an impact on the overall results, has been a US government policy shift to move into more unstable areas after 2019, so Laure-Hélène and other areas, and also doing less activities in the more stable areas such as Somaliland, where it's actually easier to make progress. Next slide, please. So Somalia was really fascinating for us because it does APAs very differently from the other projects. So it did a baseline APA like the other projects did, because that's the standard aspect of the human rights support mechanism. But the baseline PA wasn't seen as good enough and as adding value. So actually the ABA Rowley team and Pact staff had to come in and improve that baseline PA, which was used to reconfirm the approach and refocus on how to incentivize stakeholders to expand access to justice. Then you had, instead of doing annual APAs in general, you had a range of approaches. So the project has hired 3 experts, Somali experts, who are able to give very specific, very nuanced political economy advice on what to do, who to work with, who to not work with, which activities may lead to results, which ones may actually increase tensions and increase rent-seeking, for example. They're separate from the actual delivery of the activities. They're really providing advice on demand for specific decisions. Then you've also had research being produced with a political economy lens, study on Sharia law, for example, on different regions of the country. And then when APA insights inform quarterly decisions, then that's recorded in the quarterly reports, but it's not done on a regular basis as it was in the case of Tanzania. Also, what's different is that the APA is led by the ABA Rowley research team leader, who's someone who's highly respected within the donor community and really understand what political economy is about. And then finally, as in Tanzania, we found that USAID was involved in the process of discussing the PA questions, reviewing the analysis, which sort of improved the access to the analysis for decision-making by the US. Final slide, please, Kate. And then finally, in terms of how we were able to trace whether these analysis influence decisions, as I mentioned, it's been harder to trace the analysis to the decisions to the results, in part because some of the analysis was done in a way that was very confidential. These three experts giving very specific decisions on individuals and partners we've not seen as reviewers. It wasn't widely shared within the organization because it could actually have a life or death impact. Given the clan structure of Somalia and the composition of the team, it has been a bit more siloed in terms of how the analysis has been done. We have found that the baseline APA was able to reconfirm the approach adopted by the project. So as Alina said, it reconfirmed the theory of change. We were not able to find out how it influenced the implementation of the approach, even though it's the most successful part of the project. We can't make that link. That's because of the evidence we were not given. We've got specific examples of partners or activities based on specific insights, such as doing training on Sharia law for paralegals and for judges so that they could know where Sharia law would be better to protect women's rights, for example, as opposed to relying on communal rights. Also, we were given examples that we can't share with all of you about exactly what not to fund or who not to work with, because it would go against the project objectives. And then we've made a counterfactual hypothesis, which is some intervention we found that were not informed by APAs. For example, the shift led by the US government to more risky regions has led to activities that were less successful. So out of that, we assumed that actually, if there had been more ongoing activities in more stable areas such as Somaliland, which could have been informed on a more ongoing basis by APAs, we would have had a higher rate of success from the projects. So that's it for the 3 case studies. I'm going to hand over to Alina for some of the synthesis. Next slide, please, Kate. Next slide.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. So now we move to the portion of the synthesis of our analysis. So as hopefully has become clear or has come across from the different case studies, APAs have made a difference in each of the projects in terms of things like supporting evidence-based decision-making, setting an overall strategy and approach, corroborating overarching theories of change, identifying issues to work on, identifying partners to engage with in civil society or in government, especially at the local level, selecting geographic focus of work, informing rapid response mechanisms, deciding what interventions not to support, managing fiduciary, political, and security risks, responding to shifting security or political contexts, and informing or responding to USAID strategic shifts. So what made this possible? What factors mattered in enabling the uptake of APA in the different projects, and what lessons and considerations emerged from that? This is the question we now hope to shed light on. And let me turn to Laure-Hélène to get us started. So next slide, please.
That's it. We've got the slide, Alina. So basically, great. The first one is management commitment. And that was upfront because of the way in which this human rights support mechanism was designed, with Pact playing a role to make sure APAs were being done in all the projects, and also all the projects were reviewed. So we've got these biases in how we're analyzing these case studies. But that was critical because if you don't have APAs embedded within your project management cycle, you can't then have them regularly inform decision-making. So I think that's a really good piece of advice for designers of projects or implementers of projects. What was critical as well is to have the leadership of the project being committed to using APAs. There's no point APAs being produced if those making decisions are not going to pay attention to it. And we had a really good range of examples where that made a difference. Tanzania was a nice example because the chief of party is someone who moved up the project, so I was involved in APAs at different stages. And he's also someone who's very good at networking, really well connected, so could think and work politically on an ongoing basis using the insights of the PA. So that has been quite critical. Having Pact with a dedicated role and dedicated resources on APA was critical as well. So both staffing within the project were reviewed, but also the role of Kate and Mason at headquarters in DC was also really important. Being able to produce guidance, commissioning learning studies, and so on. Developing decision trackers to see the link between APAs and results was also important. And finally, for us, management decisions around resourcing. So not just having staff involved in the project, sometimes consultants were involved as well, but also making time, deciding staff time should be allocated to spending time doing the APA. In Tanzania, the whole team was involved in the field work, in the analysis, in the discussions. So that's a critical first set of factors and lessons related to it. Secondly, we found that the APAs were tailored to the different contexts. So Alina and I have described the ways in which they were done differently. In Somalia, hiring 3 experts to give very detailed, nuanced local knowledge about who to work with and how to work with them. Contrasting that, for example, with Tanzania, where you had quarterly APAs that were being done, for example, that were discussed within the whole team. So in every project, it was being done differently to meet the needs of the projects. And also, from the point of view of the team having to manage different risks. In the context of Somalia, this idea of keeping some of the analysis siloed was done because of the conflict-sensitive risk. We interviewed other donors who decided to do APAs differently within their own projects, did not keep the information so siloed, but that's a management decision to assess the risk for their staff and how they want information to be managed. And finally, on how APAs were being used within the projects, it was regular analysis each time. There was a cycle through which it was being done, which then fed into the regular decision making. So fed into work planning, quarterly reporting to USAID, and then USAID decisions as needed. We also found the more specific the APAs were, the more they could actually inform decisions. So the broad baseline APAs were useful to set the scene, to revalidate the approach, for example. But the more specific studies that were being commissioned, for example, in Tanzania, as the political context shifted, new openings came up and the team could decide whether or not to invest in those new opportunities. And that was quite critical. In the same in Somalia, deciding whether or not to focus on Sharia as an important issue of intervention and therefore doing a study to complete the knowledge gap. And finally, because the PAs were so tailored to the different needs of the project and the context, there is to some extent a bit of a trade-off between the research quality and the accessibility of finding. The more in-depth you go into the research, the more sophisticated your analysis, sometimes it's harder to see what the implications are for the projects. And sometimes the Somali analysis, there was a bit of a gap between the analysis and then deciding what to do because the context was so hard and the nuance of the findings was so sophisticated. Versus perhaps APAs that are less in-depth, you don't go back to evaluate all your key political economy factors, but you have findings that are easier to act upon. Over to Alina for the next slide.
Yes, thank you so much. So just to highlight 2 more factors and a set of lessons and considerations that emerge from them. One is around the extent to which APA is seen as a lens or a mindset and not simply as a one-off product of analysis. And some of you who may know me and Laure-Hélène have heard this before. But this is really important to think about political economy as an approach and not as a product or a report that is being produced. And team soft skills, as opposed to purely technical skills, are essential to this for both consortium partners and for USAID as well. APA uptake also seems to benefit from an open team working culture in which findings are shared internally, diverse views are heard, and in particular, inputs from local staff and experts is valued. This emphasis on staff skills, mindsets, and working culture highlights lessons and considerations related to both recruitment and organizational support and incentives to develop and sharpen these skills, these kinds of skills and approach, which is something that Laure-Hélène also mentioned in relation to management commitment. And then a final factor that is really important to highlight is the role of USAID itself, since USAID exerts considerable influence on whether APA can be used to inform project decisions and how deep that process can go. So involvement of USAID staff in APA processes is important for buy-in and uptake, and we saw that very clearly in the examples that we looked at from Tanzania to Colombia. But more fundamentally, perhaps, it is also crucial to understand the political economy of USAID itself and how it is embedded within a framework and institutional context of different pressures from the US government, for example. So for example, if strategic priorities are not aligned with APA insights, then APA will have more limited traction as project decisions will not be taken on the basis of APA alone, but on the basis of other criteria. And this may affect the effectiveness of different interventions. And we heard that here hinted at by Laure-Hélène in the example of Somalia. In addition, we also found in our review that despite corporate commitments to thinking, working politically, and collaboration learning and adapting on paper, which, all of USAID guidance really embraces all of these principles on paper. In practice, it has proven more difficult for USAID to provide the kind of flexibility and space that is needed for testing, experimenting, and taking risks. And I think this came across very clearly in all of the three cases where the fundamental theory of change has not really been put to test, and the assumptions have not been sort of visited and revisited with a idea of actually perhaps acting on them if they're not panning out. So that's important to keep in mind. Though I think it's also important to consider that USAID has tried to provide at least some modicum of flexibility through modalities such as the rapid response mechanisms and by defining project objectives broadly enough so that projects can pivot activities as long as such choices can be justified, including on the basis of evidence provided by political economy and other forms of analysis. A couple of considerations emerge from this issue of the role of USAID, which I wanted to highlight briefly. Firstly is around using the evidence emerging from this learning review and the experience of HRSM projects more broadly to advocate for USAID to work in ways that enable uptake of APA, not only on paper, but also in practice, and also encourage Pact and other consortium partners to push for flexibility in the way they themselves work, and to test constraining USAID rules rather than assuming that those cannot be overcome. I think this brings us to the end of our presentation. We are sorry we have taken so much of the time here, but we did want to have the opportunity to highlight as much of the insight from the report as we could. And now I think we'll have a round of questions and answers, hopefully. Well, not answers, discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alina and Laure-Hélène. Really interesting presentation and concise overview of what is in the report. So as we've mentioned, we'll open it up now for questions and discussion for 15 or 20 minutes before turning to Laura and Adam for some reflections. We have, so you can use the chat or you can raise your hand and come off mute to ask any questions that you might have. We have our first question from Riff Fullen. Aside from the not directly funded engagement of team members, for example, USAID staff, could you give an indication of the relative cost of an APEA, either as a range or perhaps as a percentage of program funding? I'm thinking of the first iteration of an APEA. Alina and Laure-Hélène, I'm not sure this is something that you discussed with the teams.
I think this is for Pact to share the information. We didn't review budgets for the APAs.
Yeah, so I'm not sure we can give a budget figure, but to say that there are a lot of different factors that influence how much an APA costs, and some of those are whether you're doing it totally in-house, whether you're doing it with international staff who may be traveling, or only staff who are already on the ground, whether you're using any consultants either internationally or locally. It depends how many geographic locations you want to travel to collect data, whether it's primarily in the city, in one city in which a project is taking place, or in a range of different geographies that require travel. Depends on how in-depth you want it to be with how many stakeholders. There are a lot of different factors. Some of these are outlined in Pact's Political Economy Analysis Handbook, which we can drop a link to with the caveat that it is in the process of being updated and expanded upon. So we will spam you all with that update when it is released. Let me take some of the hands in the air. We have Michael Lerner and then Fleur. Do you both want to give your questions first, and then we'll turn back to the chat?
Can I just say that we went to grad school with Michael Laure-Hélène? I don't know if you remember him, but it's so nice to see him.
Good to see you both. Thanks very much. Really interesting presentations. Really quickly, I was wondering if there was any assessment during this sort of assessment process, if you looked at the extent to which the APA results were possibly shared with, or even better yet, validated with other humanitarian and development actors, that other meaning non-USAID funded actors outside the consortium, and if so, to what extent they might have had an impact on the behavior of those actors and their programming.
So I'll take this one, if I may. So Michael, we didn't really do an evaluation, so we didn't assess to what extent results were shared with other projects and other donors. That would have required sort of a different research and fieldwork, I think. But for example, for Somalia, one of the results was that other donors had been influenced by the research funded by the Access to Justice program in Somalia, because it's such high quality research in a country where there's a dearth of data. It's dangerous to go and collect information. And the project was well set up to get that information. So I interviewed 2 other donors to validate what the team was saying, which is they've been influencing others. And one of those was the UK funding the UN to do a project. I think there was an impact to that extent, that the APA's insight can be multiplied when the findings are shared. Thanks.
Great, thanks.
Okay, should I go?
Great. Fleur, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. So this is Fleur Gersovich. I'm trying to connect some dots here of something that sparked me when you were speaking. I've been looking at other sets of cases from Pact where some of them used applied political economy. And there's something that I think connects what the cases that you were sharing, which is something along the lines of when APA meets agents with this mindset, teams can practically open this black box of civic space. So they can point to, even in context that we would assume, oh, that's called civic space. Well, no, they're better able to identify topics where they have leverage points or where they might do harm and therefore not go in. And so it strikes me that, and I wanted to hear more from your cases, if this is, one way of thinking about the value of APA, because then I think that's an important contribution to how we think and how we advance research in civic space more generally, which is beyond both what you're doing and what I'm doing, but strikes me that cuts across as a very important point for the state of the conversation around what do we do with this idea that civic space is closing everywhere.
Kate, I see a couple of questions on the chat that are related to Colombia, and I also wanted to respond to Michael's and Flora's questions. So maybe can I have a go at this and try to respond?
Yeah, do you want to pause for a moment? I'll read the 2 Colombia-related questions, and then you can respond to both Fleur and those Colombia ones at the same time. So the questions relating to CCD were, there's so many different analyses being conducted in the Colombia project. That's not unusual, and it becomes overwhelming for teams to have all these assessments, and especially to be able to apply/integrate the findings into the work. Do you have any experience with trying to combine APA with other required assessments, GESI analysis, conflict assessments, etc., into one tool and combined analysis? If so, what are the lessons? If not, do you think this might be a viable approach for the future? And then the second related to the Colombia PEA is, in what ways did running your PEA through 6 different lenses lead to any challenges in analysis, making sense of the information you collected or in decision making? So Alina, if you want to go ahead and respond to those.
I'll be very brief here, but I did want to touch base on Michael's point, because one of the things that struck me when I was doing the research for Colombia was the extent to which the migration crisis from Venezuela was a phenomenon that hit all of the international actors working on the ground and the government of Colombia in such a way that they didn't really have enough information to understand what was happening and how to address what was happening. And that is where CCD, despite the fact that it had so many different frameworks of analysis, came in with a function of generating knowledge and evidence about what was happening that was really foundational and fundamental, not only for the CCD, but also for the government of Colombia and for all sorts of partners at the local level. So they did have a function where they were sharing the insights from the PA with local partners, and this sort of understanding that the crisis had to, or the way to address the crisis had to shift from a pure humanitarian focus to one that was much longer term developmental, focused on human rights and on citizen security and on social cohesion, did have great impact and resonance, because as I was saying, all actors were sort of struggling to figure out what to do. And this was a very important contribution to sort of an understanding of how to move forward. In terms of the analytical frameworks, yeah, this was a very complex, let's say, way of setting up the consortium. I want to go back to the point that I made earlier, which is that there is no point in seeing political economy analysis as yet another form of analysis that has to be superimposed to all of these other frameworks that you already have on your plate, because then it becomes sort of an imposed thing, right? The beauty of political economy is that it really is a lens or an approach or a way to look at something that can help you look at issues having to do with gender and social inclusion, conflict, what have you, through a more politically aware lens. And it's just about understanding what kinds of questions you need to be asking around the why some of these things are happening. And so the advice that I would provide is to try to really focus on what is the substance of the different analyses that you're doing, that you really want to rescue, and not to sort of overburden frameworks with too many terms and concepts, and just really focus on the substance that you care about. And really, from a political economy perspective, it's about understanding how change happens and why, and what that means in terms of potential entry points. Perhaps now we can move to our discussants, and then we can take another round of questions. Thanks.
Kate, I can respond to some of the comments in the chat if there's time.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So there was a question about influencing USAID at midline, but we've got two USAID discussants, so we're going to leave that question to you. Starting with the last question from Matt Cassidy around sharing a PEA, whether it's good to have two versions, one for the client, one for a broader audience. That's often done. And in the project we reviewed, we had, for example, APAs being shared only within the project and with the USAID, but the findings being shared verbally, for example, with partners, and also producing not just a Word report, but also a PowerPoint, which is shorter and more accessible. So you have lots of ways in which you can actually share the insights, but really think about the impact of who you want to influence and how, and also who you don't want to put at risk, because you're sharing a written document which can then be traced to some authors. On the COVID period for the APAs, some of the work was done remotely. That's been the impact on everyone doing PA across the board. But we didn't find a major stop in the APA process, at least for Somalia and Tanzania, the cases I reviewed. The work kept going, but it was just adjusted. And for Somalia, the work kept going at a distance. And actually, because you can't travel to Somalia, you have to rely on local expert. It didn't make such a big change, for example. And then there was a final question around this trade-off between high quality analysis versus being operationally relevant. The point there is, again, this idea of being really focused on the decisions you have to make. So you have to decide where to operate, with whom, on what issue. If there's a change in the government context, you then know what decision has to be made around that specific question, and then your research can be well targeted. But it doesn't mean that sometimes broader APAs are not helpful. So for an induction document, an introduction for new staff working in a country. When donors engage in Somalia, it's important for them to actually have this lay of the land explained to them. Or sophisticated issue like the nuances around Sharia law, it's important to have a more in-depth report. It also gives decision maker a feel for how complicated the real world is, and you can't make simple decisions. So there's value in those more nuanced documents, but then the actual impact on decision making is less direct. You have to have that information processed by advisors, technical staff, and they input into discussions, and they take a view on what to do in that context. So I think these are the main questions in the chat, Kate, and I can go back over to you.
Thanks, Laure-Hélène. And I want to turn to Cheyenne, who's had her hand up, patiently waiting, and have her question, and then we'll turn to Laura and Adam. Cheyenne, go ahead, please.
Super. Thanks for the presentation, guys. I'm Cheyenne Sherbatka-Church from BESA Global, and we run the Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy program. I absolutely recognize that you found influence in a number of different cases, but I'd like to understand more about the value. So what I mean by that is, were any of these decisions made quite differently than they would have been done otherwise? Were any of the decisions counterintuitive? And I guess what I'm getting at is, these are elaborate, fairly large-scale processes, and did they add significant or sufficient value? Or could more simplified, Alina, I really liked how you boiled it down to, what needs to change and what are the right ways to create change processes that support relevant issues in these countries. So could you comment on where you found people reflecting in your conversations of, wow, we wouldn't have done this, we didn't think of this, to understand the value rather than simply the influence? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Cheyenne. I can briefly say for the Colombia case, there are a lot of examples, and I think the distinction you make between influence and value is really interesting. I would say that what really struck me most about the CCD in Colombia was the disposition and the commitment of the staff to work from what was in the setting and in the context, rather than arriving there with sort of predetermined ways of working. And so, for example, there was one really important piece of legislation that was passed by the new administration, the new government in Colombia under the new president, that basically from one day to the next normalize or stabilize the status of the migrants from Venezuela in ways that had not been expected, but was very important because, as a policy change, it was a huge window of opportunity. But there was a challenge about understanding how migrants could then actually regularize their status using the policy, and how programs like CCD could do to, in fact, help migrants to do that. And I don't think they would have been able to respond as quickly and as in such an agile way if they hadn't been doing a lot of the work that I was saying earlier about sort of evidencing and understanding what was happening in Colombia with the migration crisis, and really take advantage of this window of opportunity. Another example for me very clearly was around the kinds of local partners that CCD was able to identify and work with as a result of doing the work of the political economy analysis in an agile way, especially through the rapid response mechanism that really enabled the CCD to identify these partners who were working on issues of concern and interest in a more established way, but had not been in the radar, for example, of the government, and then CCD coming in and brokering important relationships there. So for sure, a value add. I don't know if this would have happened without political economy analysis, but for certain, the analysis made it possible and viable to tackle the problems in an agile way that was grounded in what was happening in the context. Thanks.
And just to add for Somalia and Tanzania, so in Tanzania, some of the NGOs disagreed with the conclusion of the baseline APA. So the way we summarize it, we make it sound really simple, but there were debates and disagreement, and even now, some of the old NGOs didn't want to have to work in this way. So it was counterintuitive for them to make those decisions. In the case of Somalia, the APA said, let's not fund these partners, where the rest of the project thought they would be great partners to work with, or USAID wanted the project to work with them, or the donor said it'd be great if you could work with them. So again, I don't know whether it would be counterintuitive, but it was a genuine decision that was made based on those insights that hadn't happened before. The example I give, which is politically sensitive, but I'm not American, so I'll be able to say it. The USAID portfolio shifted because of US government decision to work in the more unstable areas of Somalia for geopolitical reasons. The project did not advise the US government to work in this way, and probably would have advised the government not to shift in this way. And they were not able to do analysis before some of the projects started in those more unstable areas. The projects, from reading the documents, I concluded were less effective. Then the project started having activities, but they stopped, in part because they were the wrong activities to have in that context. So for me, this is a powerful counterfactual evidence of things happening for reasons that were different from what an APA would have advised, and it led to sort of lesser results. So I think those three things prove the added value of APA. It could be that another type of analysis would have come with a similar conclusion. We're not saying APAs are absolutely unique and the best possible analysis you could ever do, but they definitely added value in this context. Back to you, Kate.
Thank you both, and thanks, Shane, for that question. I think maybe in our next round of Q&A, we can also keep talking about maybe the value of baseline, these large studies versus some of the more ongoing and the value of the large baseline studies versus some of the quarterly or ongoing contextual analysis that the projects have done. Okay, Laura, I'd like to turn to you to offer some reflections on this conversation, anything that has really resonated with you or struck you as you reflect on the report and the discussion thus far.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thank you for inviting me to this. This has been an absolutely fantastic set of presentations, and I actually spent a lot of time reading through the study as a whole. I wanted to pause even before I get into the pieces that resonated with me, just to appreciate the fact that this was really part of an institutionalized approach across the human rights support mechanism, which really, I think, to me, provided such an opportunity to demonstrate the impact of PEA-informed approaches across country context modalities. I think, this actually, this focus on the systematic use of applied political economy analysis across country and regional projects remains really unique. But at the same time, I feel like the integration of PEA and TWP in the context of human rights programming really provides a really powerful example of the ability of these tools to ground the work that we're doing in a much more nuanced understanding of local power dynamics that clearly here enabled programs to have an impact in incredibly challenging country contexts. So I wanted to pause just to appreciate the fact that this remains unique across USAID. I think it's an outstanding model for DRG and other sectors, but it also really speaks to the power of these approaches in these really challenging contexts. Certainly, as we think about what resonates, I was excited to see the question pop up in the chat, because I was actually going to go here as well about, kind of the relative value of, kind of big inception studies versus, kind of going back and kind of checking in on the political economy over time. Certainly, one of the things that really resonated to me and that I was excited to see in this study was the integration of PEA throughout the life cycle of these activities and the impact of doing this. Certainly, as somebody who's been, very involved in the use of PEA in field missions, certainly there is a huge amount of
Looks like we have temporarily lost Laura. Let's give her a second to reconnect.
Can you guys hear me okay? Am I back?
You cut out as you were saying, as someone who's been involved in many field missions, and then we lost you.
Okay, so I guess what I was getting at was, certainly, the power of an inception PEA to really, kind of set up our strategy and approaches to working with government is important. But certainly, I think in dynamic contexts such as the ones that the study really highlights, I think it really, kind of clearly articulates the importance of the use of more regular or lighter touch PEAs to really, kind of continually be identifying changes in context and opportunities and constraints on a more regular basis. There was a question in the chat around, kind of how you can build influence, through the use of a midline PEA. I mean, I think, the study does a good job, I think, of crystallizing a few key factors. I think the importance of really targeting or focusing questions, getting a clear sense, and frankly, having some frank discussions with us, if USAID is the donor, about what's really on the table and where we have space to kind of adapt approaches to address these, kind of emerging issues, I think is really critically important. But I was really excited to see the extent to which, kind of the regular use of PEAs was really enabling these programs to adapt over time. I think the other area where the study really resonated with me was its focus on the use of political economy analysis as a risk mitigation strategy, but also, to be very frank, the limitations that donors may place on that approach. I think the study did a great job of illuminating where PEAs can help identify the interventions to not support because they won't be politically feasible or could entrench patronage networks. I think, the fact that, if you look at the Tanzania program, the work that they were able to do in a context of increasingly constrained space, and the importance of using these regular PEAs to really identify, kind of go and no-go areas is really important. And I think the fact that, and I'm thrilled that we've got Adam here too to speak to this, the fact that DDA was able to continue to work on human rights issues in a really constrained space speaks to the power of this approach. But I think the other thing the study does a really great job of putting on the table is the challenges of external influences, often imposed by the U.S. government or other donors on programmatic decision making. This really, Laure-Hélène spoke to this as well. I think, certainly from my experience, even in a technical office that's committed to the use of political economy analysis and thinking and working politically, we do have a variety of other influences in our decision making that's beyond the technical office and in some cases beyond USAID. And I think here, certainly something that we've been looking to, kind of to really push on from Washington is the importance of ensuring that missions have unearmarked funds, longer term funds, and more flexibility to really be able to take more locally attuned approaches is really critically important. But I think the other thing that this study does a really good job of putting on the table is the importance of strong working relationships between USAID and implementers to be able to do this work effectively and to be able to balance external and local imperatives. I think, I know we're quickly running out of time. I think the last thing that I wanted to put on the table was just the extent to which the study does a great job in highlighting the various influences on the uptake of PEA findings, right? We talked already a little bit about the importance of involving USAID staff in these processes, but I think it's also important to, identify it's not just, kind of the involved staff, but also, frankly, a shared commitment to, kind of balancing evidence-driven approaches against, kind of really understanding what is contextually important is really critical to that, right? If you have, kind of staff on the implementing partner side or staff on the USAID side that are overly focused on, kind of taking an evidence-based approach and, kind of focusing on, kind of best practices rather than, kind of more locally that really came through here that I know a number of folks that were raising questions.
Laura, we've lost you again temporarily.
Sorry, am I back again?
You are. You were talking about balancing best practices versus locally led approaches, I believe.
Yes. So I think that's a, you know, kind of a really critical factor to building those relationships. I think the last thing I'll say before turning it over to Adam is really the point that the study really drives home really well of, you know, kind of balancing the opportunity to share PEA findings where this is possible and the extent to which this really built trust and shared objectives with key stakeholders, but also, you know, kind of balancing this against, you know, kind of ensuring that we are conducting political economy analyses and information in ways that are context and conflict sensitive. And I think one of the things that really resonated for me in this study is the extent to which vesting leadership and local experts, which seemed to me to be the case across all of these case studies, is so important to this approach and to ensuring that we are mitigating risks to implementers, to beneficiaries, and to researchers who are taking forward these programmings. So again, thank you all for having me, and really excited to hear from Adam.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. And Adam, I will turn it to you to also offer any reflections that you have from the learning report or from today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Kate, and everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. So yeah, this is a great opportunity for me kind of to be here, share with all of you. And I guess I'm lucky, or maybe not, that I'm speaking after Laura has spoken about the kind of resonance. So yeah. So I mean, first and foremost, I wanted to kind of commend the review team that did a very amazing job. And seriously, if I mentioned here that everything they presented resonates very well with my understanding and the value I personally attach to APAs. And when I say that, I wouldn't be overstating. So yeah, everything almost resonates from me, and more so that Laura has just shared reflections on the resonance, which I agree, right from the theoretical grounding of the APAs and to its practicality in the ground, from the DDA in Tanzania to CC, to the activity in Colombia, to Somalia. They all kind of bring out really great stuff, like from working as looking at APA as an approach, as a mindset thing. I think that is a great point that this is making, although I understand it's quite complicated because mindsets do not just come. They need to be nurtured and be socialized, and to which Pact takes a lot of my kudos for trying best to nurture the approach. Also to the empowerment side and localization side, as in Tanzania, seeing the two staff mentioned here, Solomon Kibona and Crispina Mwacha, taking charge of the quarterly and the monthly and whatever they wanted to do. And that is an example of how great their approach could be, but even the philosophy behind it, that Pact has tried to push it to people, and people stepping up. This also kudos to the two Tanzanian staff who are taking up their approach. So probably maybe I talk more about my own reflection on how I found, or sharing my kind of reflection, yes, about how I find the APAs have been very helpful in our context. So this approach, which I fell in love right from the design phase of the activity way back 2016, 2017, has been really instrumental in supporting decisions within the DDA project, and as well as outside. Yeah, so within DDA project, that the activity, I mean, the review has shown it was really, and at some point we were quite depending upon it, because like kind of not helplessly, but like depending on, I can make a case when I think was 20, when in a fourth year, when I was reviewing a work plan, and I thought we were kind of getting desperate about the overall objective, like of supporting and improving the CSO's ability to influence the national level policies. We were kind of not attaining much. So I was of the opinion as AUR, I was can the activity shift its theory of change and shift the objectives? Maybe instead of advocating for these key national level human rights policies, which we think we can't achieve with this kind of regime, to maybe building the resilience of the activities. And the question was, which we all agreed and subscribed to, was, you know what, let us wait for the APA the next quarter in the fourth year, maybe to tell us what there is. And we are looking to it, and depending on like what will come up, and maybe fortunately the fate came in, and there was a transition about the former president and the new president, who took a different turn. Within USAID realm, the DRG context, we depended to quite great extent to deepening our understanding of the context. To severally, the APAs, whenever they're conducted, this yearly and the quarterly event, were quite significant, and one of the most reliable sources to affirm and confirm our so many assumptions about the context and even doubts about the context, especially then. And even so we use them to deepen our understanding of that, the fluid and rapidly changing context those times. And even when a new regime came, it was very significant to helping our thinking and working politically, to understanding what hopes we can have, what fears of the unknown we can have with the new regime. And this was informing our programs, our thinking across the DRG realm. And to some extent, I can attribute that the other three sister activities as well never gotten into significant challenges with the previous regime, despite the constrained civic and political spaces, partly to this understanding, not directly, but to some extent. I wanted, as I wind up, I wanted also to talk about the value question. A colleague here asked about the value question. I wanted to kind of chime in on the other way of looking at it. The DDA, I think the baseline DDA came up with the go and no-go zones, but it caused a conversation within the DDA's advisory committee at some point that, well, some members were like, you know what, the no-go zones are the zones that we needed to go. And that conversation and that awareness, I would say, contributed to the careful programming and continuing to program in Zanzibar, which was even extremely sensitive then, following the nullification of the 2015 elections. It was cautious, but then yes, this is a no-go. And now we are aware about what we can anticipate. So let us be careful, but not just completely abandon working in that kind of context. I found this was a very important kind of reflection, and generally the use of APAs in this project makes it, to me, stand out as one of the most activity that there was lots of pauses and reflections. Like almost every year you have a pause and a reflection onto what you are doing, and which I really hold it very highly, and I think it is a great practice. So with that, I'm happy to end here, and happy to take questions and chime in much later. Asanteni sana. Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you so much, Adam. Okay, we have a few minutes for any lingering questions or any new questions that have emerged from Laura and Adam's comments. we will also, I want to reserve some time at the end for a final question to the panelists. So I'll take one or two questions now, either in the chat or with hands raised. Maybe there has been such rich discussion in the chat and previously that everyone is questioned out. Okay, that makes my job easier. Lets me give more time to the panelists for my final question, which is just asking everyone, Laura, Adam, Laure-Hélène, and Alina, in that order, to share just your top takeaway from the discussion and one recommendation that you would make to ensure that PEA can actually help us to achieve the impact we are looking for. So again, a top takeaway from the discussion and a recommendation to help ensure APEA helps us to achieve impact. Laura, can I start with you?
Sure. So I might have spoken to this, but I think my main takeaway really is the power of the, kind of the integration of PEA and TWP to advancing and adapting, kind of politically charged initiatives in ways that have really enabled the achievement of significant results in some really, really challenging contexts. And so as we think about recommendations, I certainly, from where I sit, I think one of the things that this study brings through really clearly is the importance of really integrating the use of PEA throughout the life cycle of the project. And so I think really thinking through, kind of not just how do you work this analysis in, but how are we, kind of as a donor agency, building in those opportunities to pause and reflect and really take on board those findings throughout the life cycle. I mean, the fact that we were able to do this working on, kind of human rights and access to justice issues in some really challenging contexts speaks to our ability to do this more broadly as an agency. So I'd love to see us making more space for this in other sectors as well.
Great, thank you so much. Adam, your key takeaway and recommendation?
Thank you very much again. So, wow. So my key takeaway is that I think it is from like USAID point of view, or from my looking at USAID, I think it's really very important to kind of get involved in not only consuming where you lack appetite because you were not part of the preparation, the marination and everything. So like scaling up your participation, if we really meant to achieve what we want to achieve, getting involved, and broadly, probably the difference of our team, because it's rather small, probably couldn't be scalable to other cases where there are so many people, but the more you are involved, the better understanding, the better uptake, the better use it is. And that is my kind of key takeaway. I'll continue kind of thinking about that, how best we can be part of the kind of the process. And on the recommendation, I think weaving the APAs within the design, from the design to the execution, lessens it. Even if I left USAID, because I was trained, I was lucky. I had participated training, APA training 2017, end of 2017. So it was kind of advent, was kind of prelude to this. But then if it is weaved in this one, it will reduce any bureaucracies on the side of who is presiding, who is being the AOR of this, because it is part of that. And then why should I be reluctant? This is part of the design, it's part of the award, and it's part of the work plan where I have substantial involvement. Asante sana.
Thanks so much, Adam. Laure-Hélène, I'll turn to you next.
Yes, I'll come in with something a bit different, which is Pact and the human rights support mechanism has built up capacity across all the projects to do APA. And you've learned lessons, you've got methodologies, you've got training, you've got staff on the ground able to work in this way, consultants who've adopted the approach, counterparts have used the approach. I'm just wondering, as a question to Pact, to Freedom House, to USAID, what can be done with that amazing resource that's been developed? Because we like to see PA in the policy practice, not just as a report, not just as a mindset, but the capacity that can be shared within societies and a way of seeing the world that's important for change makers, for civil society activists and others. So question back, I think, to all of you, what can you do with this resource as all the projects come to an end and the human rights support mechanism comes to an end? It'd be quite good to be able to capitalize all those achievements.
I won't respond to that right now, but it is a good question to chew on. Alina, over to you.
Okay, one very lighthearted takeaway and then a more serious one, but I am so happy that Laura in particular read our report and liked it. So some people are reading longer stuff, so I'm very excited. But I think one takeaway that really came across very clearly from me is something that Flor touched on when she was asking her question or sharing her experience, which is that using political economy and having that sort of internalized lens really enables people at the front line to react quickly to what is happening and to navigate what are really treacherous, complex situations and identify entry points where you might think that the doors are closed. And I think the example that Laure-Hélène shared around Tanzania in particular is very relevant to that, as is the experience in Colombia. In terms of recommendations, or really considerations, I will sort of keep sounding like a broken record, but I think in the measure that people can focus on the substance of what political economy analysis is meant to be and inject it as a lens and sets of questions that can inform everything that you do, so that you don't feel like it's sort of an add-on or some huge thing with an acronym that has a life of its own. I think that's really what is most important, and that's really the seamless shift, I think, from only thinking politically to also working in more politically aware ways. And lastly, I want to say thank you to Kate and the Pact team, because it has been an absolute joy to work on this review. So thank you.
Thank you so much. The feeling is mutual. Just one thing before I close, to Laure-Hélène's point about building capacity, a few things just to keep your eye out for. I mentioned earlier we're making a revision to our APEA for Human Rights Practitioners Guide. So the second edition of that will be released within the next month. It incorporates some revisions based on this learning review and our 2019 learning review, as well as an additional chapter on gender responsive and inclusive APEA. We'll be releasing a toolkit that we use alongside that just has some meeting agendas, reflection and recommendation tracking, things like that, as well as a video that is kind of an introduction to APEA, very short for people who may not be familiar with the concept, to sort of demystify it a bit. So those are a couple of things that will be forthcoming from Pact as HRSM comes to a close. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to thank our wonderful panelists and discussants for their contributions today, and especially to Alina and Laure-Hélène for leading this learning review for us. I'll also make a closing pitch to take a look at the piece posted yesterday on Duncan Green's blog about this learning review, which Lauren will drop a link to in the chat. And finally, thanks to all of you for your contributions today. They were very thoughtful and insightful, and I think part of a much broader, rich discussion on this topic. So we really appreciate your time and interest, and look forward to engaging with you further on this.